It's Wednesday night, and we're in a study on the Old Testament, and we came to Exodus, the 12th chapter, and that took us into the 10th plague that was brought upon Egypt by God. And God said he was going to kill every firstborn in the household of Egypt, everyone that did not have the blood of a lamb without blemish upon the doorpost. Now, I've been giving you all the information I can about the spiritual Passover. Everything in the Old Testament is what the Bible calls in Hebrews 10:1 is a shadow or a skia, a shade. A shade is not the real thing. You make a shade if you go out in the afternoon at 2 o'clock. You cast a shade on the ground. That's not real. The real thing is you that cast the shade. Well, that would be the very image. The law having a shout of good things to come, and not the very image, cannot with these sacrifices take away sin. The blood of bulls and goats do not take away sin. Image is the word icon. Icon. It's the same word as predestined to conform to the image of his Son. It means a likeness. It can mean a statue, but it's not talking about a statue or that kind of an image. The context is talking about everything in the Old Testament. The temple over here, there's the temple, or it's Solomon's temple, or it's also the tabernacle in the wilderness, built under the same measurements. Here's the veil. The Bible says in the New Testament that the veil is his flesh. The veil is his flesh. And the Bible says again that the bread of God that comes down from heaven is the flesh. The bread is the flesh. So the flesh equals the bread. And the bread is the body. And there's only one body. And the body is the church, according to Colossians 1:18 and 1:24. For his body's sake, which is the church. And the body is equal. The bread is Christ. And the body is the church. Let me put equals the church. Equals church. And we're only the bread because Christ is in us. So, that's the veil. The 7 candlesticks that was over here was 7 literal candlesticks. Over here, the Bible says this is the refined church there in Revelation. Refined church. 7 is the number of divine refinement. 7 is the word Sheba in the Hebrew. It comes from Shabuah. And Shabuah is the word oath. And to take an oath from God, Shabuah, common meaning for it in the ancient world, meant 2-7. Oneself. And God tells us that we have to add 7 things to our faith in 2 Peter 1 and verse 5. And he says, besides all this, give all diligence, add to your faith, and he starts naming 7 things, starting with virtue and knowledge and temperance and so forth. And he says all these things have to be added over years. And then he says on down there, he says, if these things be in you, you'll never fall. Therefore, make your calling and election sure. The word sure doesn't mean to be positive. It's the word bibios. Bibios means to stabilize. Means to stabilize. If you add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you go through these 7 things, you'll be 7'd before God, but that's a lifetime. It takes you a long time to take an oath to God and say, I'm going to serve you regardless of what happens in my life. So the 7 candlesticks is the refined church. The table of showbread. We being many are one bread and one body. That's the church. 1 Corinthians 10:17. The altar of incense. You got one over here. This smoke went up as a sweet-smelling savor to God. And the Bible says in Revelation 4 and 5 and chapter 5 that the incense is the prayers of the saints. Well, that would be over here. Prayers over here. Prayers of saints. And then the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was called the house of God, because he would dwell between the cherubim upon the Ark of the Covenant. And the word dwell means to build a house or to marry. And he was married to Israel. He said he was. In fact, he said he gave Israel a bill of divorce there in Jeremiah the 3rd chapter. And the Ark of the Covenant over here was sprinkled. Over here, sprinkled. And over here, the Ark of the Covenant is our hearts. Our hearts are sprinkled in Hebrews 10:22. Hearts sprinkled. The law was written on tables of stone. Tables of stone over here. Tables of stone. There's a table of showbread. And altar of incense, the candlesticks, the Ark of the Covenant. Over here, the law is written on fleshy tables of our hearts. Fleshy tables of hearts. And we are elected unto obedience in the sprinkling of blood, and that's atonement. Atonement is the word kafar, and that is, to atone is the word kafar, and the noun form is kofar. The first word kafar means to cover. Second word means to stain and to dye. Has the exact same meaning as baptize, baptizo, with bapto. To cover with a stain or dye. That was a household term. And these two words were incorporated into one word in the English language, baptize. They simply took the last letter of the word baptizo and changed it to an E, and they converted that word, since they had no word in the English language. None. According to Mr. Girdlestone, there was no word they could translate baptizo and bapto into, so they just anglicized. Anglo means English. Anglo means English, and they anglicized. To anglicize something means to turn it into an English word. They didn't have a word. If it had meant to immerse, they would have put immerse. It did not mean that. Mr. Girdlestone says, one of the great Greek scholars in the last several hundred years, says it had a dual meaning. It was a household term that women used to stain and to dye clothes. So, kafar with kofar, and kafar is the word pitch. The ark within and without with pitch, kofar. It was the pitch of the ark that saved the people. It was not the water. The pitch, they would pitch. Pitch was something called bitumen. It was asphalt in its natural state, and they would pitch boats to keep them from sinking. It would seal up the cracks, and we're sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise until the day of redemption. It would seal up the cracks in a boat and keep it floating. As 8 souls were saved through water, the like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God. And that takes a lot of teaching. He's talking about the same way the people were saved in the ark. We're saved by blood baptism. That is an atonement, and that's something God does to our hearts. We don't have anything to do with it. Our will has nothing to do with his atoning for us. And when Jesus, and the pitch was a red stained dye. It was called henna color. I said that one time when I was preaching, and one lady said, I work in a beauty shop, and I know what henna is. It's a red color. When women have their hair dyed red, it's red. So, baptize and kafar, or atonement. Atonement and pitch are the same word. Now, what in the world does that have to do with everything? Well, it has to do with the temple, and they had all these holy days, and their holy days would start in September, October, and they would go through, not September, October, March, April. Why didn't somebody stop me there? March, April, which was their month, Nisan. I've started to write Nisan. April, which was Nisan. That's the first month on the Jewish calendar. It was called Abib in the ancient world. It's called Abib, same month as Nisan, when they were carried captive into Babylon. This is the Babylonian term they used. And it would end up here. It would end up here in Tishri. It would start with Passover back here in Nisan. Then 50 days after Passover would be Pentecost. Pent means 5. And that was the 50th day after the Passover. And when Moses went up in the mountain in the 19th chapter of Exodus and brought the law down in the 20th chapter, that was the first Pentecost. Pent means 5. That's 50 days after the Passover. You get to Tishri. Tishri is the 7th month of the Jewish ecclesiastical calendar. They had a religious calendar. The religious calendar would the calendar they used, a year-to-year calendar, was Nisan to Nisan. But their religious calendar had to do with when the crops started coming out. Crops, and that was the promise of God, and that came out in March, April, in Nisan, and this was the crop season, or the season of light. And then whenever they would get up here to Tishri, they would go into the darkness. Heard somebody say this on TV the other night, and I was watching a documentary, and they said something about when you get to the down here to the well, if you start up here in the middle of summer and you're at the summer solstice, which is June 21st, and down here at December the 21st is the winter solstice, the longest nights of the year. This is the longest days over here. Well, when you get to September 21st, that is the fall equinox. And I heard him say this on a fall equinox. Well, that means equal night. Equal night. That means there's 12 hours a day and 12 hours the night. Well, they said, well, you go into the equinox here, and then you come out of the winter, and you get to the spring equinox. And they said, when you get to the spring equinox, that means equal night. And they said, and y'all have heard me say this, it was just a verification of what I keep saying. You got 12 hours in the day and 12 hours in the night. Well, the next day you're going to have 12 hours and 5 minutes in the day. Let's just say that's approximately something like that, 12 hours and 10 minutes or whatever in the day, and 11 hours and 55 minutes in the night. And they made the statement. They said, light begins to overcome darkness. And that's the festivals of the Jews, when light starts overcoming darkness. And remember, God tells Abraham, I'll be your God, you'll be my people, I'll give you crops, your basket will be full, your crops, your fields will be full, your womb will be full, your children will be healthy, and you'll conquer your enemies, as long as you're obedient to me. So Israel's their time is the time of light. If this was June 21st, and this is the fall equinox, and this is the spring equinox. Well, this is why Jesus said, he tells the Gentile church at Ephesus, you were darkness, but now you light in the Lord, walk as children of light. That's why, of course, when you get down to the pagans, all of their festivals begin here, what we call Halloween, at the end of the harvest. That's the Celtic, that's Samhain, S-A-M-H-A-I-N, or Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, Roman Catholic Unholy Day. And they get down here to the winter solstice, December the 21st, and then you start back, headed back to summer, back to the Jewish light holy days. So the only thing they have as far as their season, to their gods. They set a birthday for their gods, December the 25th, all the sun gods, because they thought the sun was burning out here. And all through here, and you got Mardi Gras among the Franks. Mardi Gras, that's a 7-day festival. The Feast of Saturn's a 7-day festival. And the end of the harvest was the Celtic form of the Feast of Saturn that they appointed for, because they said the sun's burning out, it's getting to the winter solstice. And I thought that was amazing. Somebody said, well, when they get to the spring equinox, light begins to conquer darkness. And that was some commercial guy making a documentary for some Discovery or something. I thought, well, that's good. I'm glad you said that. Light begins to conquer darkness. And darkness, so whenever all the gods of the darkness were in this dark period, the sun is at its darkest in this period, and the Jews, it's in the light. And God says you have to obey me. When you obey God, you keep the Passover, you keep Pentecost, and you keep the atonement. Well, the atonement is God sprinkling our hearts, isn't it? That's what it is. And we don't have anything to do with that. The high priest does that. Now, in this festival, in the festival of the Jews, he said, we've been in this study of the Passover. He said, my Passover will be here for a memorial forever. Well, what in the world happened to it? Everything over here, Old Testament equals New Testament. That's what you call an equation. That's an algebra equation. What you do is you look for the shadow over here. You find the very image over here. And the best way to study New Testament is study the Old. The best way to understand what's in the Old Testament is study the New. You have to study them in conjunction together. Now, what happened to the Passover when Jesus died and the Jews were scattered? The Passover and all the other festivals became spiritual in Colossians 2:14. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances, which was contrary to us, took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. Now, when Jesus is having the last literal Passover, this was the shadow. Everything becomes the real. The real is the spiritual. And the Passover now is spiritual. We keep saying. You had 4 items at a Passover. 1, 2, 3, 4. What's the first item? A lamb, what? Lamb without blemish. And what's the second item? Unleavened bread. And what is leaven a picture of? Leaven is sin. So it has to be a lamb without blemish. And remember, they would take the lambs on Nisan 10 and keep it in their house to Nisan 14. Well, look here. Look over here at the original Passover in Exodus 12. This is the 10th plague where God kills everyone that doesn't have the blood over the doorposts of their house. Look here in chapter 12 of Exodus. You say, Jim, you keep going over this. Well, I don't think everybody gets it all of a sudden. All right. Look here, chapter 12. And he says, speak ye, verse 3. Speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, Moses, and say, in the 10th day of this month, month Nisan, he says it'll be in the first month in verse 2. Look here. This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It'll be the start of your ecclesiastical year, or it'll be the start of your regular year from year to year. Nisan, first month on a Jewish calendar, or Abib, whatever you want to call it, of this year to you. Speak ye all to the congregation of Israel, saying, in the 10th day of this month they shall take to them every man a lamb according to the house of their fathers, and a lamb for a house. And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the souls. Some say there could have been anywhere from 300,000 to 500,000, even more lambs killed on the day that Jesus died. But Jesus was the spiritual Passover lamb. Every man according to his eating shall take your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish. This is the Passover lamb. A male of the first year. You shall take it from the sheep and from the goats, and you shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month. They kept it in the house. You keep hearing me say. He said you take the lamb on the 10th day in verse 3, right? You've heard me say they kept it in the house 4 days.
So it could be a lamb or a goat?
Yeah, but they usually use the lamb. And you shall keep it unto the 14th day of the same month, the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel, and you shall kill it in the evening, and they shall take of the blood and strike it on the 2 side posts, on the upper doorposts of the houses wherein they shall eat it. Let me just ask you this. If they killed the lamb instead of the firstborn, and it saved the life of the firstborn, would you call the lamb a substitute for the? Well, certainly you would. There are people that say that Christ wasn't a substitute for us. He was not only a substitute in the atonement goat, but he was also a substitute in the Passover lamb. He was our substitute for our sins. We're supposed to die. And the firstborns, when they place that blood over the doorpost, it's the same thing as, I've heard preachers say this since I was a kid, it's God placing the blood over the doorpost of our hearts. And he says, when I see that blood over the doorpost of your heart, when I see the blood, 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 I will pass over you. That's the death angel will pass over us, and we will not have an eternal death in hell because Jesus paid for our sin as our substitute, as a vicarious, which means substitutionary atonement. And then he says, and they shall take of the blood and strike it on the 2 side posts, on the upper doorposts of the houses, wherein they shall eat it. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire, and unleavened bread, and bitter herbs shall they eat it. Eat not it raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire his head and his legs, and the purtenance thereof, or the heart and the bowels. And ye shall let nothing of it remain until morning. That which does remain of it, in the morning you'll burn it with fire. And thus shall ye eat it with your loins girded. Boy, that makes some of those Baptist preachers mad that I grew up with. Say, don't believe in those shorts. Those shorts will send you to hell. You ever been around when the old country Baptist preacher says that? And since women are shaped like they're shaped, I heard them used to say when they wore them pedal pushers, which were pants down to here, and they had a little curve in there. Y'all remember that, don't you? And wear them pedal pushers, they look like a bunch of clothespins. I've heard that. Well, to gird up your loins meant to take, they all wore a skirt type thing. They were complaining because men were dressing like women went, or women were dressing like men by wearing pants. Well, they all wore pants when they girded up their loins. In fact, they wore big diapers. They'd pull their clothes up, they'd pull their garb up, pull it up between their legs, and pin it up so they can go to work, or they can go to on a journey. This very thing here, and when you read about the Jews and men like Edersheim and some of the Jewish culture books, they will tell you that the Jews ate, due to this right here, they ate their festivals. This is the last Passover. This is the first Passover. They ate their festivals lying down. That's why those pictures on the wall of the triclinium table, the triclinium, because they girded up their loins, the triclinium was like so. It was a table with 3 sides. That's why they called it triclinium. And the servant would come in here, and they would lie prone on their sides like so. And they would lean on their left arm, and they would eat with their right arm. And to lie in someone's bosom meant to lean back and talk to the person behind you. When John lie in Jesus' bosom, it's the stupid for Leonardo da Vinci, who was a homosexual, to paint a picture of everybody sitting on one side of the table. It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. I won't have one in this church. I won't have one in my house. It's stupid. They were lying on a triclinium, and I've got probably 100 or 200 pictures of tricliniums in my library, from one book to the next. That was called a feast table, a dinner table, and they ate all of their feasts. The fact that John the Baptist was lying in Jesus' bosom, it don't mean he's sitting there on the same side of the table going like that dumb picture. Of course, what do you expect a homosexual painter to know about painting a picture of Jesus in the Last Supper? Not a thing. Take those things down if you have one. It's like that old Mel Brooks movie. He comes in, he says, this is not going to... Da Vinci comes in, he says, we got a guest, and he says, this ain't going to work. Everybody on the other side of the table, if I'm going to paint you. It's just one of the dumbest things. It's amazing that people don't ever question things, isn't it? You'd think somebody come up and say, that looks dumb. Who did that? Well, he was a brilliant painter. Well, great, but what do you know about theology? Nothing. So the fact that it says they girded up their loins, that means when they were eating the last Passover, Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 21, Luke 22, and John 13, they were eating. This is the verses, and of course 1 Corinthians, what we talked about last week. 1 Corinthians 11th chapter is simply quoting Jesus from these chapters. That's what it's doing. But they were eating the Passover, the last literal Passover. Last literal. Last literal. And when Jesus said, this cup is the New Testament in my blood, you can't say that without knowing what a cup is. Because later in that chapter, Jesus says in chapter 26, later in the chapter he says, he's in the garden praying, Father, if it be thy will, let this grape juice pass from me. Huh? It's dumb, isn't it? Not let this grape juice pass from me. Let this cup pass from me. He's talking about dying on the cross the next day when the Father's going to separate from him. And Jesus is going to utter the words, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's the moment he took upon himself the sins of all the elect of all time. And that's what his fear was. It wasn't of dying physically. It was a fear of the Father turning his back in heaven and not able to look upon him at that moment. It's the things that these people are saying, and they've taken this thing and called it crackers and grape juice. They actually call it communion in a church. Pass it around, everybody holds on to it till everybody else gets theirs, and then this bread is my body. I don't understand. Doesn't anybody know what the body of Christ is in the Baptist churches and the Church of Christ? Does nobody know what the body... How many bodies are there? There's one body, Ephesians, the 4th chapter. There's one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one body. If there's one body, and the mystery of God is that the Gentiles should be fellow heirs and of the same body, and it's been kept a mystery through the ages. And the Scripture says in Colossians 1:18 and Colossians 1:24 that the body is the church. And Jesus is saying, this is my body. He used the word esteem. Is. The common word that we would say the word is would be enai. Enai. Enai is the word to be. To be. It's being. And when we say be, we think of be, is, am, are, was, were, being, been, have, has, had, do, does, did, shall, will, should, would, may, might, must, can, could. Every one of those are all the being verbs, and they're all a form of the verb to be. Well, that would be this word, enai. This word esteem can be to be, but it can mean to mean or represents. So what he was saying, where everybody gets, passing around crackers and grape juice and call it communion, where they get it, it's from these chapters right here. They get it nowhere else, and they're eating the last Passover. Last literal Passover. Well, what happened to the Passover? If the Passover is to be a memorial forever, according to this 12th chapter, if it's forever, what happened to it? It's still here. Jesus is nailed to the cross. This is on Thursday night. Thursday night. It's somewhere around 9 o'clock. They're eating the Passover. And Jesus said, this cup is the New Testament in my blood. The word testament, diatheke, means last will and testament. But he's still standing there alive with them and says, this cup is the last will and testament, and I want you to partake of the last will and testament. When he says cup, to drink of a cup meant to undergo a death. Well, how can they partake of a last will and testament and he's standing right there in front of them? He's not dead yet. Well, the scripture says in the Hebrews, the 9th chapter, that a testament is not of force until the death of the testator, starting there in about verse 15. Reading on down, several verses. If a testament doesn't have any force till the man who wrote the will is dead, what Jesus is saying, I'm going to be dead later this day. It's 9 o'clock at night. What do you mean later this day? Well, their day began at 6 and ended at 6. So later that day, when there's darkness from the 6th to the 9th hour, 12 to 3, that's the 6th hour of the day, 12. Their daylight day had a day that began, they called them hours. The first hour of the day was 6 to 7, 7 to 8, second hour, and so forth. 6 to the 9th hour was 12 noon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That is the same day on a Jewish day, calendar day. That's the same day as 9 o'clock the night before. He says, later today, I'm going to be dead around 3 o'clock, and I want you to drink this cup. Well, I keep saying, he could not say, there's impossible for him to be saying, I want you to drink some grape juice. If he had been saying that, he would say, I want you to do a ritual. That's not possible because when he was nailed to the cross, somewhere around 12 o'clock, the rituals were nailed to the cross, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances, which was contrary to us, took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. All the rituals were done away with. And everything that was once literal became spiritual. The Passover became spiritual. Who was the Passover lamb according to 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter? Jesus was the Passover lamb. Well, if the Passover lamb is spiritual, all the rest of it has to be spiritual. God did not mutate the Passover to crackers and grape juice. That is foolish. All that crackers and grape juice will do, along with dipping people in water, it'll lead you way back into sin and into captivity. If you think pass around crackers and grape juice is what Jesus was talking about when he said, you do show the Lord's death till he come, how do you show the Lord's death? You drink a cup, don't you? Because drinking a cup is the same thing as a daily cross, isn't it? Daily cross is death to self. Drinking a cup is death to self. Repentance is death to self. They're all the same. You cannot, he could not possibly have been saying, soon as I'm dead, do some rituals, because the rituals were nailed to the cross with him. And the Passover became spiritual. Unleavened bread. What's the unleavened bread? Huh? The church. See, Mary knows this stuff. We being many are one bread and one body, over there in 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter. We're the bread. But we're only the bread because we eat of Christ. And what's the third item? Huh? 4 cups. And the third cup that was passed around at the Passover was called cup of blessing. And Jesus took the cup and blessed it at the Passover. That was the third cup. And he says, this cup, this death to self is the New Testament. That's what he was saying. This is very figurative language. It's metaphor. They spoke this way. We are so shallow. We have length and width to our language. They had great depth and great nuance. Nuance means shades to something in the Greek. They didn't talk like we talk. That was 2,000 years ago. Another society, another culture. It wasn't the way we talk. Good night, you guys out there. Go to bed. I'd rather they go to bed. I'd rather they go to bed than preach. Good grief. Now, so he was saying that night, when I'm dead, since this is a testament, and the testament has no force until the testator is dead, he couldn't possibly be saying do something right now. Then what was he doing handing him a cup? What was he doing saying, this bread represents, it means my body? What was he doing? Why did he say that? It's a contract. Contract. In their contracts, that's what a testament was. It was a contract. I give you this, what you do after I'm dead. And in the testament, you had to partake of it in Israel. It was absolutely required. It was mandatory. So he says, I will leave my testament with you, and you will do this. You will die. You'll drink the cup. He couldn't be talking about doing anything else. Well, what was he doing? What happens in a contract? You remember some things that happen in a contract? Huh? 2 witnesses, right. There's some other things about a contract. 2 witnesses.
To cancel it out, you put a nail through it.
Huh?
To cancel it out, you put a nail through it.
You drive a nail through the original contract to invalidate it. They would get the 2 witnesses in public. And they'd say, do you remember when these 2 men right here had this original agreement? They'd say, yes. Now, they've come to the conclusion they want to invalidate this. These same 2 witnesses understood? Yes. Is everybody in agreement? Yes. Drive a nail through it is the same thing as taking a notary seal and notarizing a signature. That's the same thing. Something else about, besides 2 witnesses and a nail through it. Well, you had that. You had Christ as a go-between. But I'm thinking of something specific. Why was Jesus saying, this represents my body? Somebody, you're missing it. What did they do with their contracts? They acted them out. They performed a contract. When you're in real estate, you put up a house for sale. A bunch of people come around and look at it, and a contract is offered. If someone wants, I sold real estate for 17 years, and the seller looks at it and well, I won't do this, and I don't want this price, and I'm not going to leave my refrigerator. And they cross it out and initial it and put what they will do. And then you take it back, and so the other people say, well, we'll accept that, and they sign it. Specific performance of a contract is to go through everything that the contract calls for, the survey, the credit reports, have the house appraised, and after the people are approved that are going to buy it, you go to the closing attorney, and the papers exchanged, you sign the papers. That's called specific performance of a contract. That's what it's called. Specific performance. Probably comes out of the ancient world. They performed contracts. Let me give you a couple of performances. Go over here to Ruth, the 4th chapter. I'm going to stay on this till we really nail this thing down about crackers and grape juice and water and the whole thing. Go over Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Ruth comes right after Judges. Ruth. Now Ruth is a wonderful woman. But she is a Moabite. She is not a Jew. Moab is what we call southern Jordan, which is just east of Jerusalem. Just east of Israel, excuse me. And I'm sitting here talking to you, not thinking. Okay. All right. I'm sitting here looking before it, and it comes after it. All right. Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Now, if this is Israel right here, this over here is Jordan. Right here, Jordan. But in the ancient world, it was the land of Ammon. That northern area was the land of Ammon, and the southern area was Moab. And Ruth's mother-in-law was Naomi. And Naomi, she left Israel and went over to Moab. She was married, and her husband dies, and she's got 2 sons, and they are married to Ruth and Orpah. Now, Oprah Winfrey gets her name from Orpah. Her mother did not know how to spell. I figured that out, and then I saw her say that on TV one day. Her mother named her after Orpah. And Orpah says that Naomi says, I'm going back to Israel. And Ruth makes that famous statement that you hear in weddings. And it really belongs from Ruth to Naomi. She says, whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou liest, I will lie. And thy people shall be my people. That's what Ruth said. So she goes back. Orpah stays over here. Nobody ever knows what happened to Orpah. She stays over here, and Ruth goes back over here, and she comes in contact with a man named Boaz. Boaz is one of the ancestors of Jesus, and Ruth ends up marrying Boaz. But Boaz doesn't have the right to marry Ruth. There is what's called a nearest of kinsmen. Nearest of kinsman. And the near kinsman, he had the right to redeem the woman who was nearest relative, a woman who she had to be redeemed by him or bought by him, and there was a price paid for her. Well, the nearest of kinsmen says, I cannot buy her because I already have a wife. And she has been gleaning in the fields of Boaz. Boaz is an older man. Now, when there's the laws of the Jews that they had to leave the fields ungleaned. Glean meant to go and pick up the leftovers, what had been dropped when they were gleaning a field and taking in the harvest or the sheaves. A sheaf, instead of rolling them up in bales like they do today, these great big old square bales, they put them in these sheaves. Bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves. We shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. When they were gathering the sheaves, sometimes some of it would drop out. They had to leave those in the field for the poor. The Bible tells us that over in the book of Exodus. You have to leave it in the field for the poor. And you could not glean the corners of your field. You could not go in there and take the corners of your field. Those were left for the poor. Well, Boaz, he sees Ruth, and that is the custom of hospitality among the Jews, to leave the gleanings out there. So he began to leave handfuls on purpose. He'd drop them for her. And she saw this wonderful man, Boaz, and she began to sleep at his feet, and he would put his blanket over. That meant she was a possession. So he goes to the nearest of kinsmen and says, you have a right to buy her. He's hoping the guy can't buy her, and he can't, and he says, I will buy her. And he performs a contract. I want us to look over here in Ruth, the 4th chapter. This is exactly what happens with us. In the 4th chapter, let's start reading in verse 1. Then went Boaz to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And the kinsman came and sat down beside Boaz. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, you sit down here. I need some witnesses to this. And they sat down. And he said unto the kinsman, Naomi, there is come again out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land, which was our brother Elimelech's. That's the husband of Naomi. And I thought to advertise thee, saying, buy it before the inhabitants, before the elders of my people. He's talking to the nearest of kinsmen. If you will redeem it, redeem it. Boaz evidently was one of the leaders among the Jewish people at this time. Redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me that I may know. Because I want this woman for mine. You got to read the rest of the book to see how that Naomi was drawn to Boaz. For there is none to redeem it beside you, Mr. Kinsman. We don't know his name. And I am second to you. I'm after you. I get the second chance to read. Why do you think he's out here taking the lead in this? Because he wants her. And she loves Boaz. Then said Boaz, what day thou buyest the field of the land of Naomi, thou must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess, because she's heir to it through her husband, who is the son of Naomi. The Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. It belongs to not just Naomi, but to Ruth also. And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself. I've already got obligations. And Boaz is thrilled to hear this. Lest I mar mine own inheritance, redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it. So he says, she's yours. Now this was the manner in former time in Israel concerning redeeming. And to redeem means to buy back. And concerning changing, for to confirm all things, a man plucked off his shoe. You see, in a contract, they had to take a piece of their clothing and give it to the man they were buying it from. What was the clothing that Jesus gave? He said, this cup is the New Testament in my blood. It's blood, isn't it? How can that be clothing? If many of you have been baptized into Christ, have put on Christ and baptized, baptizo bapto, means to cover with a stain or dye. And we see multitudes around the throne of God in Revelation, the 7th chapter. And the angel says to John, do you know what these multitude is? He said, no. You know, you tell me. He said, these are they whose robes have been made white in the blood of Christ. The blood is the contract. That is the contracting clothing. Jesus was presenting his clothing to his elect. As many of you have been baptized into Christ, have put on. Put on is the word enduo. It means to sink into clothing. It has the same meaning as in Matthew 28, verse 19, when he tells the apostles after he's resurrected from the dead, go into all the world and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name. That word in is the word east. It means to sink into and not come out of. Has the basic same meaning as enduo. Sink into and not come out of. It can't be water, can it? Not if you sink into it and you don't come out of it. Not unless you put people down in the water. So you got to stay there for the rest of your life. And we got to put some red dye in here. And the rest of their life won't be very long unless they got an aqua lung. Now, where was I? So he took off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor in front of these witnesses, these 10 witnesses. And this was a testimony. It was a testament, a contract in Israel. In Israel, to take a piece of clothing and pass it between the two. Therefore the kinsman said unto Boaz, you buy it for yourself. So he drew off his shoe. Boaz takes his shoe off and hands it to him publicly in the front of these witnesses. That held up in the Jewish courts of law. You see, it was done in front of witnesses. So Boaz said, I want more than 2 or 3. I really want this woman. So he asked 10 men to sit down while he talked to this nearest of kinsmen. You guys watch this. These are all Israelites in Israel. And Boaz said unto the elders and unto all the people, ye are witnesses. Right? Ye are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Kilion's, one of the sons of Naomi, and Mahlon's, the other son of Naomi, and both of them died, and Orpah stayed in Moab, and Ruth came back with Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren. Remember, it was the custom of the Jews for the nearest brother or kinsman to raise up a son to his brother. Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bare Seth in the place of Abel whom Cain slew. And Seth means substitute. That the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren, and from the gate of his place. Ye are witnesses this day. Let me give you something on witnesses. On a contract. On a contract. Yep, that's the notarizing it. Contract. Under the C, in the C volume. McClintock and Strong. You see, I'm not that smart. I just read. That's all it takes. Read. All right. Contract. A business agreement or formal compact, bargain. Various solemnities were used in the conclusion of contracts among the ancient Hebrews. Sometimes it was done by a simple joining of hands, and thus the Hindus to this day ratify an engagement by one person laying his right hand upon that of the other. Sometimes also a covenant was ratified by erecting a heap of stones to which an appropriate name was given in Genesis 31, 44 and 4 through 54. That made between Abraham and the king Gerar was ratified by the oath of both parties. Also by a present from Abraham to the latter of 7 ewe lambs by giving a name to the well which had occasioned the transaction. Festivities appear to have accompanied the ceremonies attending such alliances of Isaac and Abimelech, made a feast on concluding their covenant, Genesis 26:30 and 31:54. A similar practice also obtained among the heathen nations. The Scythians are said to have first poured wine into an earthen vessel, and then the contracting parties, cutting their arms with a knife. This is where the American Indian gets this. This is where Mr. Trumbull speaks in the blood covenant. He talks about 2 men wanting to be blood brothers, and they would slit their wrist, and they would drip some blood in the man who is his best friend into his cup, and he would slip his hand in his cup. And Jesus was using a pagan metaphor when he said, when he says this cup is the New Testament in my blood. It was against Jewish law to drink human blood over there in Leviticus, the 17th chapter. You have to keep everything in mind when you're studying this. When two pagans would do this, they would stir it and drink each other's blood. And what that meant they would become friends that sticketh closer than a milk brother or a brother from the same breast. In other words, that's a friend that's closer to me than Clyde or Dean ever could be, since they don't believe the things that I believe. And a blood brother was a man who would go and stand beside you in battle, beside you, and fight your enemies with you, and fight to the death. That's what a blood brother was. In other words, you were closer than a brother from the same breast. Well, that's what this is talking about. And Jesus, the Bible says, is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother, than a blood brother. Now, let me read some more of this. The Scythians are said to have first poured wine into an earthen vessel, and then the contracting parties, cutting their arms with a knife, let some of the blood run into the wine, with which they stained their armor, after which they themselves together with the other persons present drank of the mixture, uttering the direst maledictions on the party who should violate the treaty. Another mode of ratifying covenants was by the superior contracting party presenting to the other some article of his own dress or arms. You remember when David and Jonathan met? And Jonathan was the son of Saul. And Jonathan loved David with all his heart, and he believed David was going to be the king of Israel, because evidently he knew something about the law. He knew the king had to come out of the tribe of Judah. And he knew his father was of the tribe of Benjamin. And Jonathan goes into a tent with David and takes his coat off and gives it to David. And this was a contract that you're going to be the king. Then he says, thus Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword and his bow and his girdle. 1 Samuel 18:4. That was a contract. Let me read a little bit more about the contract. Now, at the present day, the highest honor which a king of Persia can bestow upon the subject is to cause himself to be disapparelled and give his robe to the favored individual. Among the Hebrews, and long before them, among the Canaanites, the purchase of anything of consequence was concluded and the price paid at the gate of the city as the seat of judgment before all who went out and came in. From the latter book, we also learn from the book of Ruth that on some occasions of purchase and exchange, the transfer was confirmed by the proprietor plucking off his shoe at the city gate in the presence of the elders and other witnesses, including in handing it over to the new owner. Some expositors have believed that in Colossians 2:14, Paul refers to the canceling of them by blotting or drawing a line across them or by striking them through with a nail. Now, I didn't make all this up. Hope you understand. It takes a lot of research, a lot of studying, and I've got something else on this. Whenever people ask me, how do you study? And how are you going to study the Bible? Well, if you're going to study, this takes a long time. I forgot the fourth item in the Passover. Bitter herbs. The most common bitter herb was wormwood. When you look at wormwood in your concordance, every time Israel would be rebellious against God, God would say, I'm going to cause you to drink wormwood, and I'm going to give you gall to drink. And that meant I'm going to put you through fire and trials until you learn. That was the bitter herbs of the spiritual Passover. We drink the cup. That's the cup of blessing. The cup of blessing which we bless is not the communion of the blood of Christ. But it was against the law to drink human blood. But he's talking about that culture, that custom of making a blood brother with a pagan. Jesus would use pagan terminology, but he didn't use all the pagan terminology. Some people will read Trumbull, and he'll tell you about some things that are pagan. They would say, Trumbull would say, he would say, well, to drink blood to the pagan was to drink of life. No, to drink blood is to drink of death. When the Bible says, and I've had people argue with me about this, when the Bible says the life of the flesh is in the blood, in Leviticus 17 and 11, when you got a man and he's got blood flowing through his body, the life of his flesh is in the blood. But when he sheds that blood out here, there's no life in his flesh anymore, is there? So when the blood is shed and you drink the cup, you're drinking of his death because his blood is shed. When you drink the blood of Christ, it's figurative language. It's pagan culture, but he uses the cultural language so that people will understand. That's what Paul meant when he said, I become all things to all men. I became as a Jew to the Jew. I became as a Gentile to the Gentile. And I become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. He said, I'll speak Greek terminology to the Greeks. I'll speak Jewish terminology to the Jews. Well, Jim, what are you talking about? You drink of his blood. You drink of his death. You don't drink of his life. You come to life. Drinking of his life is not something you do. You drink of his life, but you can't drink of his death. He has to bring you alive, which means to come alive after dying. That's resurrection. Resurrection is coming to life after dying daily. Now, if you're going to study in the first century, you have to study Roman world, Jewish customs, culture, idioms, metaphors, idioms. That's figures of speech, metaphors. Got it straight from the horse's mouth. You mean you've been talking to a horse? That's a metaphor. I get it straight from the source is what it means. And you have to understand Greek customs, idioms, metaphors, simile, figures of speech. What's what we call it? And Greek figures of speech. Why Greek and Roman separate? The Greeks ruled back here with Alexander the Great from around 332 to 320. And then Alexander the Great dies. And the Greek culture was in the developing for about 800 years before Alexander the Great dies. When he takes over from his father Philip of Macedon, his father had organized a tremendous system that was going to be a great empire under his son. Alexander the Great gets credit for most of what Philip did, his father. In fact, his father is the one that had armies that was ready to conquer the world. If he had lived, he would have conquered instead of Alexander, even though Alexander was a great general. But he died at about 26. And he was a homosexual too, and he carried his boyfriend into battle with him. But that's what they did back then. The Roman soldiers believed they had to raise little boys to grow up to be experienced, so they took them, and they were pedophilia was common among the Roman soldiers. And they would take their little boys to battle with them. Now, when Alexander the Great's got 4 Roman generals, 4 Greek generals, who are they? And who else? Lysachamus. Ptolemy. Celeucus. I just want people to know that y'all gave me the answers. You get to where these answers are common, don't you? And who did the Ptolemies rule? Egypt. These are your two important ones in the Scripture. And who was Seleucus ruling? Syria. And it was the Antiochus Epiphanes who was a Seleucian, who was the picture of the man of sin in the Old Testament there in the 11th chapter of Daniel. Well, Rome subjugates these generals. That means puts them in control. Subjugates them, and Rome is ruling. But Rome is so barbaric, they're just about as barbaric as the barbarians they're trying to conquer. And they don't have any culture to speak of. Back here with Alexander the Great, he gave the world, all of the world, its dialectos, its dialects of the Koine. Koine is the word common, that had common street language in every city-state. And those languages differ as much as Spanish and Italian. And he gave them all their glossa. And he gave them all of their culture, their sayings, their idioms, their metaphors. And he gave them their philosophies. So all of the world, you had Zeno who started Stoicism, the Stoics. You had the Epicureans. And he gave them Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and Plutarch and all these cultural supermen. Well, when you get to Rome, they don't have that. They just go around killing people all the time. So they hold on to the culture of the Greek world. That's why Paul would say things that he'd say, there's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither bond nor free. For there's neither male nor female. We're all one in Christ. When he says there's neither Jew nor Greek, the opposite of Jew was Greek. That was everybody that was a Gentile in the world. And that's because the Greeks gave us all of our culture. And we know that today. Our mathematics, Pythagoras, all the other great scholars of the ancient world gave us all of this. They started our science and started everything else. So whenever Paul would speak of, he would say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, which is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. He would use that constantly. That's what he's talking about. So you have to study Greek culture, Greek sayings. You have to study Jewish customs and culture, Jewish culture, and I recommend books on Jewish culture. You need to get a good set of encyclopedias, the McClintock and Strong, and get the Hastings if you can. And then if you're going to study Jewish customs, there's all kinds of books on Jewish customs and culture. You have the Compendia that's got the Jews in the first century, volume 1 and 2. You've got Jesus in the time of, in the first century, during the first century Jews. What's the guy's name? Emil Scherer. And then you've got probably the people I recommend first is Alfred Edersheim. Alfred Edersheim. That's for Jews. He was a Jew. He was born in 1825. He died in the late 1800s. He's converted to Christianity, and he kept Jewish culture and custom. Now, I don't agree with everything he says, because he'll come up and say he believes Jesus started a new thing with the last Passover. He started a Eucharist. I don't believe that. And then you need to study Greek, and one of the best Greek culture writers is Adolf Deisman. And one of his best books is Light from the Ancient East. And that's what I want to read to you about blotting out the handwriting of ordinances. I had to explain that to explain what I'm about to read to you. All right. I don't expect you to understand everything. I just want you to get an idea of what we're talking about. Don't ask me a question. Say, give me 3 or 4 sentences to get the answer. I've spent 58 years, and I've noticed how the Bible just intertwines. It synthesizes together. I always think of those old synchromesh transmissions they used. We didn't have anything like that in the 50s. I had an old 49 Chevrolet, and I like to speed shift. They don't speed shift very well. You hit the gas real hard, and then you go slam the clutch and throw it up in there. And if you got a V8 Ford, it'll go, it'll peel a little bit of rubber, see. 49 Chevrolet wouldn't do nothing. But when they got the sinker mash, if you didn't hit it exactly right, your transmission would go clink, 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 and it'd be all over the ground, you know. Or at least be all inside that housing. And but the sinker mash, you couldn't. It would just come together. That's the way the Bible has to do. It has to come together. Now, I'll read a lot of things to you. I'm not going to take time to stop and explain. The question of this ancient metaphor of St. Paul's from the practice of manumission. Now, manumission means the being free from slavery. Man being remissed or being free from slavery. M-A-N-U-M-I-S-S-I-O-N. Let me read this. And when I'm teaching on something like this spiritual Passover, you can't get it in one lesson. I've been on this on the internet, and we've got all the spiritual Passover messages on there so far, this series, and there are about 12 of them, I guess, and this is just one of them. You have to go back and listen to the others to get the whole picture. The question about this ancient metaphor of St. Paul's from the practice of manumission is to be interpreted in detail. The chief point to examine is whether St. Paul regards redemption through Christ merely as a single summary act performed once for all in the past, or which seems to me, and this is the way he looks at it, probable, also an act of liberation experienced anew in each single case of conversion, and that's what I believe. But he did it in the past, and he's doing it daily in our lives. Then he says, the union of the idea of manumission, or the releasing of man from slavery, which is redemption, which is a ransom being paid. You remember we studied that in the Atonement series? Then he says, the union of the idea of manumission with the idea of sacrifice was made easier for ancient Christians by the fact that sacral manumission or at COS, cost, which means cash on shipment. Not cash on delivery, but cash on shipment. Was not complete without sacrifice. Finally, should be pointed out the affinity between the idea of redemption, or manumission, and the idea of forgiveness, remission, of our trespasses, which was established by the ancient, by the legal procedure they were accustomed to. The ancient people in the ancient world weren't stupid people. They were very bright people. They had people with genius IQs back then like they do today. They had people that are very astute at business and at studying. You have to, and they had their contracts, they had legalities, they had laws, everything was set up in a system. In cases of non-payment of money debt, the system of personal execution allowed not only arrest but even slavery for debt. That was called a bond slave. The series of gospel and primitive Christian metaphors to which we have alluded, metaphors connected with debt and forgiveness. Remember, forgiveness, aphesis, means to pardon and release from prison, doesn't it? I don't know how to give this to you, but one step at a time. I can't give it to you all at once. There's too much to it. Remember, forgiveness. Remember, prison means to be in darkness. Prison. Phylake. Means the division of day and night, or light and dark. Remember we talked about the Gentiles were in darkness and the Jews were in the light. Remember that? Well, they were serving, in the darkness, they were serving these pagan gods. In the light, that's Jehovah God, and these are the light from Nisan to Tishri, or from March, April to September. These are crop months while the sun is bright. And forgiveness, prison, phylake, means the division of light and dark. And Paul tells the pagan Ephesians, you were darkness, now are you light in the Lord, walk as children of light. You walked after these gods in the ancient world, now you're walking in God's light. So you got dark and light. Light is the horizon, isn't it? Forgiveness means to pardon and release from prison. Release from darkness and be taken to the light, and that's prohorizo. Horizo is the word horizon. It means to bound inside the light. Pro means before. Before the foundation of the world, God has pre-horizoned his people, or predetermined them for the light, or to be spiritual Israel. In the light, get the crops of God. Now, where was I? All right, let me continue reading this. Or likewise taken from the legal practice of antiquity, and might receive many an illustration from the New Text. So, too, there are plenty of original documents on papyrus to teach us the nature of an ancient acknowledgement of debt. A large number of ancient notes of hand have been published among the Berliner, Mike could pronounce this, I can't, Griechike, Urgunden, and probably every other collection of papyri contains some specimen. A stereotyped, we're talking about forgiveness and debt. Remember that. We're still talking about blotting out the handwriting of ordinances. When these things which were contrary to us, they were contrary to us because they put us in prison. That was the law, the rituals of the law. A stereotyped formula in these documents is the promise to pay back the borrowed money. I will repay. And they all are in the debtor's own hand. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances. Well, the handwriting is in the hand of the debtor. Or if he could not write in the handwriting of another acting for him with the express remark, I have written for him. Christ has written for us. Thus, for instance, in the very vulgar note of hand, that doesn't mean cursing. Vulgar is what is secular. The vulgar note at hand of 100 silver drachmae written in the Fayum in the 1st century A.D. for two people who could not write by one Pappus, who was himself as much of a writer we have, which we, and this is quoted from that papyrus there, which we will also repay beside any other that we may owe. I, Pappus, wrote for him, it should be them who is not able to write. And then he says down here in the notes at the bottom, referring back up to here, our technical expression, among others, for a memorandum of debt is the word handwriting, or chirographe, or graphon. Graphe, remember graphe means to write. So chirographe, chiro is the word hand. He says, hence the technical term, handwriting. We're talking about a technical legal term in the 1st century. Colossians 2:14, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances. Writing by hand. And it gives Bible studies by Deisman as a reference book, and that's another one of his books called Bible Studies. Now let me continue reading. Not even going to try to explain all of it. The parallelism between the legal formula, this is from Deisman's Life from the Ancient East. This is Greek culture. Paul is writing to Greeks. When he's writing to Colossia, they didn't live in Greece. Colossia is over here on the end of Turkey. But they were Greeks because everyone was using Greek culture. You get it? I don't mean to be insulting, but I want you to understand these things, so I'll repeat it. The parallelism between the legal formula and the letters of St. Paul becomes still clearer when we observe that the ancient note of hand generally took the form of a letter acknowledging the debt, written in the handwriting of the man who was in debt. There's two handwritings, isn't there? One is on tables of stone over here, kept inside the Ark of the Covenant. Now the law is written in fleshy tables of our hearts. And who did that? Did we do it? No. God wrote in our hearts his handwriting. And one of these is blotted out, either the one on stone or the one in fleshy tables of the heart. Which one do you think it is? It's the shadow over here that's been blotted out. He's not going to blot this out in our hearts. He says, I'll write it up on fleshy tables of their hearts. He says that over and over, doesn't he? He says it in Hebrews 8. He says it in Hebrews 10. He says it in 2 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter. He says this over and over. The ancient customs connected with the law of debt. We have a debt. We're in debtor's prison. We're bond slaves. He has to buy us out of darkness. That's called ransom, isn't it? Some ancient customs connected with the law of debt must be at the root of the celebrated passage in Colossians 2:14, where the technical expression handwriting equals a bond is employed in a religious sense and brought into a remarkable connection with the cross. Crossing out. Christ says the apostle has given us all the debts incurred by our trespasses. The handwriting nailed to the cross, does that mean it is crucified, dead, ineffective? You know how much studying there has to be to really understand the Scriptures? You got to go to these historians outside of Scripture, men like Edersheim. Deisman's book is great. And he says, that would be possible, but probably the image is much livelier one. And he gives you some accounts of this in the notes at the bottom. That would be possible. Probably the image is a livelier one. There must be an allusion to some custom which is not yet known to us if we are unable to point to the source of the bond nailed to the cross. Let me read some of these notes at the bottom. He says, Egger is quite right in pointing out that by adding, albeit I do not say to thee how thou owest unto me, even thine own self besides, Paul does away with the legal and business character of what he has just written. When he wrote that, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances, he was talking about a debt. He was talking about forgiveness of a debt. What we owed, we owe a debt of sin because we've sinned, and the wages of sin is death. There's pay for sin. This is all about their legal laws in the first century. It's not just read that and whatever you think it means. Whoopee! You know. Good grief. You know, this is hard to understand reading it because you need a lot more than you got here. Then he says, it was at least a right instinct for the technical something that led many commentators to conjecture that bonds were canceled in antiquity by perforation with a nail. He says the same thing as it says out of the McClintock and Strong. Bonds were by the perforation, by driving a nail through it. That's why I say these things. Maybe some of you thought I pulled that out of the air. Now, I'll read till I find out some answers. Then he says, Eric Haupt very rightly points out in his note on the passage, the main point with St. Paul is not nailing in itself, but nailing to the cross. It's not just the nailing, it's nailing it to his cross. Slips of wood, let me read this. I got it marked with double stars on the side. Slips of wood on which the household accounts were kept had been found in Theban tombs of the 2nd century with the previous week's accounts similarly blotted out. The holes in the slips suggest that they may have been suspended on pegs or nails when not wanted for use, and so explain the reference, nailing to his cross. A correspondent, Dr. R. Klug, suggests that a connection between cross And cross out was only possible in German. And we say, let's cross that out. I wonder where we got that. Huh? Do you think somebody just come up one day and said, let's cross that out? No, it comes out of the ancient world. The letter key. That's a key. An X is a key. This is an X in the looks like a big E. This is a CH. The letter key was identified with the shape of the cross in antiquity and plays a great part in graphic representations. Do you know what it takes to really understand this? A whole lot more than is being said. I've got a book that I ordered, got it years ago, on contracts of the Babylonians. Why would I want something on contracts of the Babylonians? Because Israel was in Babylon for 600 years and they picked up all this Babylonian terminology. Rushing mighty wind, when you look up dispose of the dead in Hastings, it'll tell you under dispose of the dead, it'll tell you about Babylonian disposal of the dead, Assyrian disposal of the dead, Jewish disposal of the dead. Go through all the, and in the first paragraph of Babylonian disposal of the dead, it says, rushing mighty wind was a term in Babylon for breath. Well, there was a sound from heaven as a rushing mighty wind to these 11 Jews that were there in Acts, the 2nd chapter, in the upper room. Well, that was a Babylonian term. But if you don't read these books, sometimes I was just thumbing through. I said, I wonder what this disposal of the dead is about. I started reading about Babylon. It said, rushing mighty wind. I went, whoa. How are you going to learn that? By reading Acts, the 2nd chapter in the English? If you don't know anything about the culture, you're just lost as a goose. But the Pentecostals got it, rushing mighty wind. Whoopee! Ha! They get goofy, don't they? I'm sorry, but it was a legal term. Now, he says, the governor of Egypt gives this order in a course of a trial. This is out of an ancient text, out of an ancient papyri. It says, let the handwriting be crossed out. That was legal terminology about a debt. It's not just, you know, I've never heard anybody teach about blotting out the handwriting of ordinance, just never. The same technical word, chiazo, C-H-I-A-Z-O, C-H-I-A-Z-O, or C-H-I-A-Z-O, chiazo, I cross out is what it means. Chiazo means I cross out, occurs in other similar contexts in papyri of New Testament age. And it gives you some things down at the bottom of the page. Of course, the simple key is often the simple key. There's the key. You join a fraternity and you get a key, don't you? That's where that comes from. It's not chi, it's key. And that's the word in Christos. C-H-R-I-S-T-O-S. Yes. S in the end of a word is like this. S in the middle word is like this. Christos, Christ. I didn't get to everything I wanted to get to. I wanted to get to the firstborn. Firstborn was killed in Egypt, and God said, from then on, the firstborn is mine. And what are we predestined to be? Firstborn among many brethren. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he be the firstborn. Might is not in the text. Maybe he'll be the firstborn. That's not in there. That he be the firstborn. The firstborn was supposed to be the priesthood. But Reuben was the firstborn, but he was unstable as water, so God replaces Reuben with the thirdborn Levi. And in the New Testament, we're the firstborn. He's made us priests and kings, hasn't he? I was going to get to that, and we're going to cover that. So he says, the same technical word, chiazo, I cross out, occurs in other similar contexts in papyri of New Testament age. The custom of crossing out, which has endured down to our own day, was not a mere private one, but also an official one. We have moreover recovered the originals of a number of the crossed out IOUs. There are several at Berlin, some at Heidelberg, and other collections. The subject is perhaps not without some bearing on the origin of the latter allegorical and mystical trifling with the cross-letter key among Christians. And that's what looks like an X. And you remember, when Constantine started Roman Catholicism, he said he saw a cross in the sky, and Lactantius, his son's tutor, said he saw an X. And that was a key. So he took the CH. He probably saw something that looked like Mickey Mouse up there. What does that look like to you? Well, I think it looks like a cross. I want to go conquer by this sign. So they put it on the shields, put it up sideways on the shields of all the crusaders, don't they? But what Constantine did with it, he put the CH and the R. CHR stands for Christ, and that's the labrum of Constantine. You see that on all the vestments of the Roman Catholics, don't you? And so they come up with, to make it easier to put Christmas sales, back in the early 50s, they'd put Xmas. And my father, being an independent Baptist preacher, that's Christmas, that's not Xmas. Yes, it is. It's Xmas. It's CH Mass. And that has to do with blotting out handwriting. You know how much there is to this? Can I get it all? No. You can study this and find things that I don't understand about it, because nobody can get it all. We're talking about an entire Greek, Roman, Hebrew culture in the first century. In fact, no, I won't go into anything else he said. It's too much. And then he says, oh goodness, don't need if I go into all this. All right. He goes into diatheke and goes into the parakletos. Parakletos is the word comforter, and is really good. Mr. Deisman is excellent. I'm just reading to you a little bit from the Ancient East. You've got, do I have any time? I've got several other, over in Ezekiel 4, 1 through 8. Very quick, Ezekiel. What Jesus was saying, this bread represents my body. They were having a contract. And it takes 2 witnesses to verify anything in Israel, doesn't it? By the mouth of 2 witnesses. Not by the mouth of one will a man be put to death. Over there in Numbers 35 and over in Deuteronomy 17, Deuteronomy 19. And Jesus tells the Pharisees, in your law, the testimony of 2 men is true. And you do not rebuke an elder over there in the 5th chapter of 1 Timothy, except in the mouth of 2 witnesses. I'm out of time. I'll finish up these contracts in the Old Testament. And Ezekiel lays on his side, his left side, for 390 days, and lays on his right side for 40 days. This is a contract. He's performing a contract, and he sets these tiles up in front of him, and he knocks them down. What he's doing is contracting to Israel what God's going to do. We've got a lot of contracts throughout the Bible. And right before he says, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances, he says in verse 8, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, after the rudiments of this world, not after Christ. The word tradition, paradosis, is the Mosaic traditionary law. It's something said down from one generation to the next that has no foundation in truth. And he says, after the rudiments of this world, not after Christ. Rudiment is the word stoichion, and that's what the Jews call all the rituals in their temple. Paul is saying rituals will lead you away back into darkness. And then he says in verse 11, we're circumcised with a spiritual circumcision. In verse 12, we're baptized with a spiritual baptism. And that was the method of going through proselytization. And then he says, blotting out these rituals plus all the rest of the rituals, which was contrary to us. It was a debt to us. He took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. All of this was legal terminology in the first century. It's just like going down here and talking to a lawyer and he starts spewing out legal terminology. Paul is giving you some legal terminology in their courts of law. You can't just yank out the verses in the King James Bible and say, I think this means I'm just a country preacher, but God's revealed this to me. Go back, go plow. They saw it like the old ancient independent Baptist joke. Some guy looks up in the sky and he sees GP and he thinks it means to go preach, and God is actually saying go plow. Let's pray. Father, thank you for truth. Lord, help us to get a picture of this whole thing. That you've blotted out what was contrary to us. You did the blotting out, and you've written this upon fleshy tables of our hearts. You blotted out the old law, which was rituals that led us away into darkness. And you renewed us and ransomed and brought us back and brought us to the light, to the horizo. Thank you for your word. Cause us to continue this work, and we'll praise you for all things. In Christ's name we pray, amen.